Hello everyone, welcome back to a new video. Today I'm going to be making a fantasy papercut light box. So let's just get right into it. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you know that I have some templates up on my Patreon. I've gotten a lot of comments asking about whether I have templates for my projects, and I have a few up on my Patreon right now. So if you want to support me a little bit, or you just want to make one of my light boxes for yourself, check out my Patreon. I'll have the links in the comments and the description down below. Now back to the video. For this project, you will need 12 sheets of cardstock, and you need to draw a 1/2-inch border around all of the layers. This project was inspired by a half-finished drawing that I drew a while ago, so I used that for my inspiration. The first layers I started on were the trees. I traced the trees and cut them out. This was pretty simple since I could copy and trace the drawing that I had. The scene I wanted to depict is very magical. It's a fantastical forest that's flooded with a bunch of water. It's like in a deep ocean. There's a pirate ship exploring this magical world, and as they enter the flooded forest, they're greeted by a ginormous snake coming down from the trees that is probably going to eat them. Try to do a lot of variety in the trees, making the foreground trees thick and big, and then the background making them smaller and thinner, and I think that looks pretty good. Then I draw and cut out the layers of the snake. I really thought it would be cool to have the body of the snake wrapping around in the trees and starting in the foreground and going back into the back of the light box through the layers. So I kept that in mind while making the body, making sure it gets smaller as it goes back. I use tracing paper to create the water. I always do because it creates this semi-transparent look that when layered on looks like water, and I really like it. I covered almost every single layer with a piece of tracing paper for the water. And now that all of the base layers are done, I'm going to add all of the details. I do highlights and shadows on basically everything. And this part is kind of long and tedious and a little boring, so while I'm working on this, I'm going to share a story that my sister made for this light box. The trees grew out of the water. This was the first thing that became apparent to Leon as he directed his crew to sail closer to the towering masses. He stared over the side of the ship so he could look down through the restless water. Peering down through the expanse of blue, the great roots of the silver trees were buried far under the water. The air was cold and damp on Leon's skin as the ship traveled towards the forest. Sunlight filtered through the gold and yellow leaves far above their heads. The horizon was hidden in a generous amount of fog, which greatly limited their vision. Leon shouted orders to his men, and together they steered the huge galleon towards the heart of the forest, which looked tiny against the looming trees. As they sailed past the first trees, the light dimmed and a feeling of unease settled over them. They sailed for a while, and as they approached the center of the forest, a faint, sinister hiss met Leon's ears. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and they sailed around the bend and discovered the source of the threatening noise. The fog had lifted to reveal a lengthy pale blue snake that rested curled around the trunks of two of the trees in front of them, barring the path completely. It was as big as the trees, and its smooth, scaly body was speckled with yellow and orange light. Its eyes were a piercing yellow-white color that seemed to glow, staring down at them. Upon meeting his eyes, the creature started flicking its tongue. The curves of its narrow yellow eyes seemed to stare at him in a strangely intelligent way. Every muscle in Leon's body wanted to retreat from the overwhelming fear that flooded over him, and he ordered his crew to stop the ship. A curtain of fog closed in around the ship, blocking them in. They had no choice but to stand their ground. The future of his family depended on it. Leon had been long-term enemies with the king. While they had despised each other from afar, it was only after a vicious sorceress started attacking the ships that transported the majority of the goods that made the country rich and powerful that things got truly despicable. Leon had always been an amazing warrior, and the king saw an opportunity to save his shipping routes and get rid of the biggest thorn in his side in one fell swoop. When Leon received the summons from the king, asking him to travel to the sorceress's domain and slay her, he laughed and refused. However, one day while he was out hunting, a group of the royal guard rode up to his house and dragged his wife away. When Leon arrived home, all he found was a message demanding for him to defeat the sorceress, and included in the letter was a threat from the king that he was going to execute his wife if he chose to disobey him. Desperate to save his wife, Leon gathered as many of his bravest men as he could and took off for the sorcerer's home. However, now that this obstacle lay curled in front of him, he was starting to doubt his strength and resourcefulness. Suddenly, without warning, the snake raised its head and slithered down from the tree until its head hung down above the ship, and there was some kind of unexplainable allure, and as its head came up, every man on Leon's ship found themselves staring into its eyes. There was a sinister glint embedded in the creature's iris. The evil light penetrated straight into Leon's soul, leaving him feeling chilly and uncertain. The snake slowly opened its jaws, and a stream of thick fog flowed out and thickened around them. For a long moment, all of the men just stared hypnotized at the fog swirling around them. As Leon stared, it suddenly clicked. Every account of the sorceress described her as a beautiful woman whose physical attributes served to hide her true nature. However, staring at this creature, Leon realized that these accounts had been wrong. This monster laying in front of them was not some unpleasant beast, but the sorceress they had traveled so many months to defeat. Suddenly, the realization of the danger they were in reached his mind, and he ordered his crew to attack. The men were drawing their weapons just as the thick tendrils of fog reached them. To the men's great horror, the fog that surrounded them took on a life of its own. It morphed and stretched until it had transformed into all manner of creatures. The men had no choice but to fight. Before long, all kinds of warriors, even wild animals like bears and lions, swarmed them. Being made from fog, they flowed swiftly across the deck and attacked. However, the crew was not fazed. They swung their swords through them with amazing strength. More and more swarmed, and as the battle wore on, it was increasingly hard for Leon and his crew to keep their footing. Then, to make matters worse, Leon sliced through one of the incredibly sinister-looking warriors. Before he even had a chance to register what was happening, the remnants of the fog slithered around him. Long tendrils of cool moisture wrapped around his arms, legs, and throat, where they tightened like a noose, and the more he struggled against it, the tighter it became. To make matters worse, the stuff no longer acted like fog. It was completely solid. No matter how hard he tried, he was unable to pass his limbs through it or rip it apart. It was like the magic of the sorceress had woven an impenetrable rope. As a result, before long, he was gasping frantically as his face turned purple from a lack of oxygen. All of his focus went towards preventing himself from blacking out, and as his vision grew foggier and foggier, he tried and failed to control his panic. His lungs burned, his eyes teared up, and a terrible dread that was as thick as the fog that imprisoned them settled in. His heart sank with the realization that most likely he would perish. Just as he was going to give up the fight and surrender to the call of death, against all odds, his frantic, scrambling brain managed to remember that even though his sword had clattered to the ground, his dagger still hung in its sheath by his waist. Strengthened by the fresh hope of using his weapon to slice through the fog, he struggled to wiggle his arm towards his knife. It took a great deal of effort, and his bands were painfully tight by that time, but it was done, and after many grueling minutes, the knife slid from the sheath into his hand. A great wave of relief washed over him as his weapon sliced through the fog, holding him captive, and a rush of air flooded into his lungs as he collapsed on the deck of his ship, panting. Before he even had a chance to properly catch his breath and collect himself, Leon was startled by the terrible sound of splintering wood, and the ship started to tilt under his feet as it broke under the blow of the snake's tail. As the deck of the ship continued to splinter and creak, panicking men slid into the water in every direction. Leon struggled to keep his footing on the listing deck. Unfortunately, he eventually lost the fight and slipped into the freezing water and certain death. The sound of the sorceress's laughter rang in his ears as he sunk into the darkness. With all of my layers done, it's time to assemble this light box. I get 1/2 inch thick foam board and cut 1/2 inch strips matching the length and width of my paper, and I assemble this light box. Then I get an LED strip and I try out a bunch of different colors. And here is the finished product. I really like it. I tried quite a few different color combinations, but this one ended up being my favorite. So yeah, if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, check out my Patreon, comment below what other projects I should do next, and I will see you next time. Bye!